David Corbett.
Hello. This novel, Do They Know I'm Running, is about an American family of Salvadoran descent. They're dealing with two crises in very short order. The first is when one of their sons, a Marine in Iraq, is very badly wounded and returns home in pieces, and the family has to figure out how they're going to go about caring for him. And just as they're gearing up for that struggle, the family breadwinner, who is an uncle, is arrested in a workplace raid and deported. The family has to decide what to do, has to find out what its options are, which one to choose, and why.
Well, David, what moved you to write this book?
I had just finished my last book, Blood of Paradise, which takes place in El Salvador. And so I was pretty attuned to Latin American issues. And at that same time, if you remember, there was a very intense and heated immigration debate going on in this country. And I remember watching it, and as the temperature began to rise in that debate, I also watched the casualty lists from the Iraq War, because the Iraq War was also heating up.
Yeah.
And I was very astonished by the number of Latino names among the wounded and the killed. And doing a little bit of research, I found out that Latino Americans were being killed and wounded in combat in higher proportions than their percentages in the armed services as a whole. And there was a RAND study asking Latino recruits why they had signed on. The general assumption was that since the Bush administration had granted preferred status for citizenship, that a number of legal residents of Latino descent were joining up to facilitate a quicker route to citizenship. But their answers didn't confirm that. The top 4 reasons they gave for signing up were patriotism, service to country, duty, and honor. Despite that, however, many of them were coming back to find out that family members were in jeopardy if they hadn't already been deported. Or as the father of one Marine put it, on one end of campus, they're recruiting the kids to fight and die, and on the other, they're kicking the parents out of the country. And that sentence galvanized for me an idea of a story, that what would happen if a family was facing exactly that crisis, having a son come back terribly wounded, and then having the breadwinner sent away. How would that family deal with that crisis?
Now you have such wonderful characters. There's Roque and Happy and Gado and Tia Lucha and Tio Faustino. I mean, who inspired these characters?
Well, that's a bit of a long story. Roque is my protagonist. He's the 18-year-old in the family. He's the youngest, and he's the golden child. He's the one who's gifted. Many people are comparing him to the new Carlos Santana. And he was inspired a little bit by the son of a friend of mine. I had met a Salvadoran woman about a year and a half after my wife died. And we became quite close. And I became quite close to her family, both in El Salvador and here. And her son was a young, very talented, very headstrong, very emotionally porous and accessible young man that I liked a lot. And I liked his temperature, but I wanted to make Roque a little bit more refined, a little bit more restricted. And to do that, I sort of fell back on my own knowledge of a couple of musicians I know. And musicians in particular express themselves almost always better through their instruments than through words.
And you're a musician yourself.
Well, I was a musician. The jokes I've been telling recently are that when I was a musician, the 2 ways I described my talent were I was the world's most adequate guitarist, or I was bringing mediocrity to new heights. And that was pretty much my career as a musician. I was in a bar band in the Midwest. But what you get when you're young and you're a musician is you realize that you've got this talent, and there's an element of pride in that, but there's also this fear because you wonder whether it's really going to pay off or not. And Roque is also the youngest in a family of boys, and I was as well. And there too, you have sort of a chip on your shoulder. You're constantly, the one toward, you're the one at the bottom of the food chain, and so you're always trying to prove that you belong, that you deserve a place in the family. And there's an element of pride to that, and there's also an element of uncertainty. You wonder whether you really do deserve that place, and that very much helped me to find Roque. Godo, his brother, is, I chose Godo, it's short for Godofredo, and I chose that name because it has a sort of clownish element, and I wanted Godo to be sort of the happy-go-lucky one, but he's also just has a nose for trouble. He's the kind of person who just doesn't know when to shut up, doesn't know when to not get involved in a bad situation. And unfortunately, that's very true of me as well. And so Godo's the kind of person who just has a nose for the situation that's going to get him in the worst possible situation, and that's what happens to him. That's ultimately why he joins the Marines. Happy is based on, well, I'm trying to think if there's an actual person that Happy was based on. There were a few. When I was a private investigator, and I worked as a private investigator for about 15 years, we did a couple Latino gang cases. And there were some of the young men I met who were just very, there was a sense of a broken promise, a sense of betrayal, and a sense of anger under that. But some of them had moved beyond that to trying to get a sense of reconciliation with the world. Rather than just descend into crime, they were trying to ride that line by being nobody's fool, but not descending into the belligerent hostility that a gang member would have. And I gave him the name Happy because street handles or nicknames are very often the opposite of what a person is. So he's happy because he's never happy. And that's where that nickname comes from.
Now, what's Roque's main problem?
Well, Roque's main problem is that he has to prove that he can pull off the task that the family has given him, which is that he can go down to El Salvador and bring his uncle back safely. Because you have the main problem now with immigrants, and a lot of people don't understand this, it's always been hard to emigrate, but now it's brutally so because organized crime and the gangs control almost all the transit routes between Central America and the United States. So to bring someone back from that region now involves a pact with the devil. And like all pacts with the devil, things go terribly wrong. And that's certainly what happens in this book.
Ooh, well now what disturbs you most about our immigration policy, our defense of our borders? What disturbs you?
Well, the main problem is there isn't a single problem. You have 5 problems that are so entangled you can't solve one without solving all of them. And that's not my point of view. That's the point of view of a defense analyst named Hal Brands at the U.S. Army War College. And he said, our present approach to the war on drugs is not going to solve the problem because it's not just about drugs. The major problem you have at the border, in a nutshell, is the fact that 50% of the world's drugs are consumed here in the United States. Whoa. And they come from Latin America. So as long as you have that supply and demand issue, I don't care how big you build that fence. When I was in Douglas, Arizona, one of the locals quipped that a 10-foot fence is nothing but a stimulus package for 11-foot ladders. Ah. And especially when you have that drug problem. But that's only one of 5 problems. The other 4 are poverty, corruption, weak democratic institutions, and immigration. And immigration is the sort of like the steam valve that lets off the pressure in these countries. When they can't solve their own problems, they allow the immigration to take place so people will come here, earn the money that they can't earn there, and send it back to help their economies. And that has helped facilitate the corruption. And the corruption is part of the drug problem. And the fact that the weak institutions are also a part of all of that. So we have to realize that it's going to be a generational. Whatever we do, it's not going to happen in a couple of years. It's going to take a generation to change. We're going to have to help build strong prosecutors, trustworthy courts. People down there don't trust their justice systems. They don't trust their institutions. You know, you have very hard-working, decent people who, by and large, vote with their feet. And we have to somehow find a way to turn that around. But it's not going to happen right away. And as long as you have this huge industry that generates anywhere from $25 to $50 billion a year in Mexico alone. Awesome. You see what the problem is, right. and so the border issue is just part of a much larger problem. When people say, you know, build the wall and deport them all, it's as though you can just turn off Latin America. And if you do that, there are 3 countries more than willing to be major players in the region, and those countries are Russia, China, and Iran. Whoa. And we can't afford that. No, we can't. We have to remain engaged, and we have to remain engaged intelligently, and we have to help those parties down there that want to turn their countries around for the better. And they're there. We don't always pick the right parties to support. And we have to be a lot more intelligent about that than we have been.
Well, now, as a fiction writer, and you call yourself a mutt from Ohio, how can you get away with depicting a culture that is not your own and about being an advocate for it?
Well, it's true. I call myself an American mutt. I know I'm a quarter Irish and a quarter German, and the other half I really am not sure of. I understand there's some Swiss Mennonite in there and there's some English, but my father was very unclear on his lineage. And But I came to this issue because I felt very deeply about it, because like I said, I knew this family very intimately. I knew that they were in the position that so many immigrants were, and that the mother had come here because there was no future for her children in her country. She loves El Salvador. She would love to stay there, but there's no future for her children there. And as a mother, she could not responsibly inflict that fate on her kids. So she came here. She was bilingual. She was the office manager for a German construction company in El Salvador, but the earthquakes eliminated her job. She had nowhere else to turn. The only hope she had was here, and that's why she came here. So I understood her plight, and I understood it. There was a decency to it. There was an honesty to it. There was a compassion to it. And I felt that that wasn't being addressed. When you would hear the debate, you'd hear these people depicted in such negative terms, and I just knew it wasn't true. So as a writer, you know, what I do is I write. So I figured, okay, I have to write a story that conveys this. Well, what gives me the legitimacy? And I just kept on coming back by this quote from John Coltrane, which has always meant a lot to me. And it is, when there is something you do not understand, you must go humbly to it. And I felt that that was the spirit I needed to have to write this book. I needed to go to Latino culture humbly, with respect, and with love. There's no other word. I had to love these people. I had to love this culture. And fortunately, I do. And but that had to be the guiding light. That had to be the thing that opened the door for me. If I saw it too much in terms of issue, if I saw it too much in terms of politics, I would be objectifying it. I needed to see it in terms of the people and the characters, and it needed to be a story that was driven by that. And that was really important to me.
In your dossier at the end, you say that audiences now crave authenticity. How can storytelling really tell us the truth?
I actually think that storytelling is essential to the truth. We do not understand the world in terms of facts. We understand the world in terms of story. Story is how we interpret the world. It's almost, for example, dogs do it through hearing and scent. We can't interpret the world without story. It's just in our nature. We invariably see things in terms of beginning, middle, and end. There's almost always a moral tail or a moral weight to whatever we evaluate. It's in our DNA. So that's essential. That's one thing. The other thing is that as a former PI, I know a lot of other, former lawyers, former cops, former PIs, and we all say the same thing. The reason we write fiction is so we can finally tell the truth. The courtroom, the whole notion of the whole truth, it never gets close to a courtroom, because there's nuances, there's backstory, there's witnesses that are never called. I can't tell you, one case in particular, it was a toxic